All right, welcome back to part 2 of lecture 1. This time around, we're going to continue talking about some sciencey stuff here. Electromagnetic radiation is going to be our first topic. So EM radiation, we'll just call it for short, is energy, really. It's just energy. So energy that travels in waves. You can pause the video and read the text on the slide. I don't like to read PowerPoint slides personally, and I'm sure it's kind of boring for you, but pause it and read that information. It's good to know. All right. So electromagnetic radiation comes from a lot of places, but it's atomic energy, really. It comes from energy that's released when an atom absorbs energy. That energy travels through space, and it travels really, really quickly. In fact, it travels at the speed of light, because that's what electromagnetic radiation is. It's light. So at the speed of light, these particles, which also exhibit characteristics of a wave, travel. They're called photons, and those photons travel through space and they bounce off of stuff. They reflect. So that energy can be transformed into different types of energy, such as heat. And you guys are familiar with that. When you park your black car in the sun in Phoenix summertime, it gets really, really hot because that light energy is being converted into heat energy. But regardless, it's just energy. That energy that's an important thing to consider, is that light is energy, because we can measure energy, right? We can measure it with instruments, but we can also measure it with our built-in, highly sensitive and very specific sensors, our eyeballs. They can actually measure light very, very accurately. So we're going to talk about this, okay? All right. This image, this graphic, displays a simplified version of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. So on the left-hand side, you've got gamma rays. On the right-hand side, you have long radio waves. And when we're talking about long, they're really, really long. That little colorful rainbow slice in the center, that's what we call the visible spectrum. So X-rays, infrared, microwave, radio, TV waves, all those waves are just light. When you start to think about that, it's kind of an interesting thing, at least to me anyhow. If our eyes were sensitive enough, if we had the right photoreceptors in our eyes, we could see radio waves. Not the waves themselves, but we would see them reflecting off of things, for example. X-rays. Can you imagine X-ray vision? If we just had more sensitive eyes, we could have X-ray vision. Kind of interesting. Anyways, we can't see all of that stuff. There are animals out there that can see infrared, like snakes and reptiles can see into the infrared. Some insects and other animals, fish, crustaceans, they can see UV. So there's all kinds of things that can see a little bit past what we can see. Not a whole lot, but some. And a lot of animals can see less than we can. Our vision is very special, though, because not only can we see color, we can perceive it, but we can differentiate quite a bit. So this next slide shows you a little bit of just how much we can differentiate. So let me toggle back and forth between these two slides. So visible light, like I said, it's this tiny little rainbow slice that you see. All the colors, that Roy G. Biv that we learned in grade school, all those colors that we perceive come from just a few little tiny nanometers of difference of wavelength on that electromagnetic radiation spectrum. So 380 to 900 or to 700 nanometers is what we can perceive. If it falls outside of that, those photoreceptors, those cells that we're going to talk about in a minute, inside of our eyes, they can't perceive them. They don't get excited when they get hit with UV light or infrared light or gamma rays like they do when the visible light hits them. So the cool thing is that tiny, tiny differences in the wavelengths of those light, from 1 to 4 nanometers, we can perceive that. So on the scale of how big a nanometer is, around 500 nanometers, just under 500 nanometers, that's about the thickness of the membrane of a soap bubble. So that's 500 nanometers. So if you slice that into chunks, into like 4 nanometers, you can see that's very, very little difference. So the difference we perceive as a dark or a light powder blue is about 4 nanometers. So we can perceive that. That's just amazing to me. Anyhow. So the way we perceive that is when certain wavelengths of light are recognized by our eyes and interpreted by our brain, we have a sensation. And that sensation is color. We perceive it as color. Now we have different sensations. We have hearing, where we can pick up energy in vibration through the air or through water or some other medium. We have the sense of smell, where we can perceive chemicals in the air, and taste, and on and on. We had different senses, right? Vision is one of those senses, and we can perceive color because light is energy, and we can pick up that energy. Just like you can hold your hand over something warm and you can feel that heat radiating, our eyes are basically feeling different wavelengths of light radiation. I don't know. Just crazy to me. I could talk about this for a long, long time, but I'll keep moving. All right. So color is just our perception of those different wavelengths of light. We talked about this already, right? So if those wavelengths of light are outside of the visible spectrum, then it's outside of our ability to perceive them. If we could perceive them, we could see ultraviolet. Our brain would fill it in with some other color maybe that we can't comprehend at this point, or it would just say infrared is like a darker shade of red or a lighter shade of red. Ultraviolet is just like a more intense version of violet or purple. But we don't. We have this one little slice of electromagnetic radiation in the visible spectrum that we can see and we can perceive. And those individual wavelengths within that visible spectrum, we can differentiate them as different colors. That's the way that it comes through in our brain, is we can just imagine them as colors. It's a completely human sensation to be able to see color like that. And the thing about color is that it's completely in our head. And we'll get to this a little bit more, and I'll maybe give you guys some links in the Slack channel, but color is ineffable, meaning we can't explain color. We can't describe color to anybody else. If you tried, it wouldn't make sense. If someone had never, ever, ever seen the color blue or anything, or they lack the physical ability to see blue, how would you describe blue? You could say what it looks like, but unless somebody can see the blue of something it looks like, they can't know. The other thing is, how do you know that the red that I see is the same as the red that you see? What my brain tells me is red is just because I grew up and learned that when I see an apple and it's red, that's red. And other people see an apple and they may see it as what looks like yellow in my head, or they may see it as something else entirely. So it's completely in our head. It's a construct of our brain. The way that something appears to us in terms of its color is completely in our head. Now, we can communicate about color by giving things names. Like we can say red, green, blue. We can say more specific things like robin's egg blue or sky blue or royal blue. So we can give names to things, or we can be even more precise and we can talk about it in 3 dimensions of hue, chroma, and value. Or if you're familiar with Photoshop, HSB, hue, saturation, and brightness, or lightness, or RGB values. We can give color a specific value, and we can label it, and we can communicate about it. And that's where it starts to get into color management and color reproduction and color metrology, when we can quantify color specifically. So an interesting question to ask yourself is what is the difference between the physiological parts of color perception and psychological color perception? There are aspects that are simply physical, meaning the anatomy of our eyes and so on are going to determine how we see color and how we perceive color and whether we can or not. For example, color blindness is simply a deficiency in certain cells to be able to perceive color. And we'll talk about this. You're going to do an activity actually where you test yourselves for color blindness later on. But it's really interesting to me to see how there are certain anatomical characteristics that can lead to us perceiving color differently. There are things that are outside of our bodies that control it, like metamerism. We'll talk about metamerism a little bit later on, but that can affect it. The way that we perceive color, we don't entirely understand. There's 2 theories, but because color is ineffable, we can't really know whether that's the case or not. So one of those theories is that we have cone cells in our eyes, and some of this is probably familiar to you guys. We have rods and cones in our retina, and I'll show you a diagram of this in a minute. But those cone cells are sensitive to 3 different wavelengths of light. And if we get a certain amount of one light and a certain amount of another light, then we see a certain color. There's also the opponent process theory, which we'll talk about in a minute too. Then we move on to psychological factors that affect color. For example, memory colors. If I were to show you, you guys can try this out. I didn't put an image in here because I have lots of kind of illusions and images we're going to look at in a bit, and it gets too cluttered. But If you think in your head, what color is something like lettuce? Let's say, random, right? Lettuce, it's green. If I were to take a picture of a head of lettuce in Photoshop, crop and tight on it so that's all it is, I could recolor that and replace all the green with yellow, make it a duotone. So there's absolutely no green in this. And I could show it to you and you would still see that. And chances are the majority of you would still see it as green because you know it's lettuce and I would tell you it's lettuce. So you would see lettuce and you would say that's green. There's cultural colors as well. And this can have a lot of different meanings. There's lots of research on this and you can go down rabbit holes on the internet too, looking this up. But some cultures that grow up where they live and breathe a certain thing, like cultures that grow up on the sea, that develop on the sea, they have lots of differences in blue. The color of water and sky, those are important colors and things that are very different, and there's lots of different shades of those and they're valuable. Other colors that developed in like desert climates, they don't have as many blue colors. One thing that's interesting that and once you learn a color, it becomes a color to you, and all of a sudden it's a color, even though it wasn't a color to you before. Think about the color brown. If I told you brown isn't really a color, you'd probably argue with me. You'd say, yes, it is. I can see it. Here's a picture of something that's brown, or the dirt's brown, or tree's brown, whatever. Open up Photoshop and find brown for me. Brown isn't really there. Brown is really dark orange. Try it out. So there are colors that are cultural, colors that are learned, and colors that are psychological. Okay. Sensory adaptation is another thing to think about, is that our brains are really good at taking that color information that comes from the wavelengths of light and then translating that into something that actually makes sense to us. We have different light sources that have different color casts, and our brain adapts for those pretty well most of the time. We'll look at some times where it doesn't here in a second. All right. So anatomy for a second. Let's look at, really, there's only one part of this that we're concerned about, and that's the retina. The retina is coating on the back side of the eye. So the image is focused through the lens and the pupil like an aperture that comes in and hits on the back of the eye. All that light is hitting on the back of the eye, on the retina, and it goes through, and there's certain cells in the back called rods and cones. And those cells get activated by light. They get excited. They send a signal down the optic nerve to your brain, and the brain interprets that. Now, there's certain cones that are more sensitive to red light, and some that are more sensitive to green light, some that are more sensitive to blue light. And depending on the proportion of wavelengths of light that are in the environment that you're looking at, then different cells are going to get activated, and your brain's going to interpret that a certain way. That's kind of one theory. Now, the rods, just incidentally, those don't really see color. They just perceive brightness. They're light. They're for luminance. They're very sensitive, so they can pick up a lot of information when there's very little light in the room. So try this out. Make your room or your space very, very dark. Turn off your computer screen, other light sources. Wait about 10 minutes because your eyes have to adjust to the dark. And they'll build up to the point where the rods can get activated off of very, very little light. And then you'll have to kind of set this up. And I may have spoiled it by telling you in this order, but quiz yourself. You have somebody set something up, some colored cards or something that has color that you don't know what it is. And you'll check that out in the dark and you'll be able to see the image, but you may not be able to pick out the colors that are in it. So, all right. Metamerism. I said we'd come back to this one. Metamerism is a kind of an interesting way to consider the fact that the source of light is going to affect the color that we see. If you look at those different spectral curves down below in the graphic, you'll see that there's a different peak and different wavelengths of light for different light sources. Fluorescent light, for example, peaks in green and orange, and it doesn't put out very much blue. Daylight is a pretty even spectrum. Incandescent is very warm and not very cool. And so you get different wavelengths of light from different light sources. And depending on what light source is shining on a material, different materials are going to affect different, or they're going to reflect or absorb different wavelengths of light. So you may see something under daylight and it'll be a certain color. And then you take it under fluorescent light and it's a different color. It's not just that it's reflecting a different color of light, but the material itself absorbs different kinds of light differently. I'll give you guys maybe a demo of this later on in the class. But it's something interesting to think about, and it's one of those factors that are going to affect how we perceive light and color. All right, take a look at this for a second. This is just an image you can find online, but notice there are some spirals here, right? There's kind of a pink spiral, and then there's a blue line and a green line that spirals in between that, alternating. So if I told you that the blue line and the green line alternated, you probably wouldn't believe me. I'm sorry, let me restart that. The green line and the blue line are the same color. You see that? The cyan, blue, and then there's that green in there. Those are actually the same color. Now, my intention was to demo this, but my recording software is not going to let me right now. So you see those two rectangles, the white rectangles on the side. I was going to use my PowerPoint color picker to fill those in. You'll have to try this out on your own. I can give you the file, or you can screenshot it or whatever. But open that up in Photoshop, and with your color picker, choose the blue and choose the green, and they're actually the exact same color. Our brain, our sensory adaptation in our brain is adjusting for this. Because of the colors that they're next to, it's going to alternate that, and it's going to make them look different to you. So interesting. I wish I could demonstrate it for you a little bit better in this lecture, but I'm not going to right now. I'll let you play with that. All right. This image, same thing. That white rectangle over there, ignore that for now. But this is an example of a thing called color constancy. Color constancy says that we interpret colors based on what they are next to a lot of times. In this image, there's actually no red pixels. Those red strawberries are not actually red in this file. Again, if you don't believe me, you can find it online. You can screenshot it and open it up in Photoshop and use a color picker on it. But there's actually no red pixels in that image, because the shift toward blue in the rest of the image, our brain just says those must be red. And if you don't believe me, you've seen an example of this before, I'm sure of it. You may not like this example, but this one, how many of you guys have seen that? So what color is that dress right there? Is it black and blue? Is it white and gold? The debate goes on, and people see this differently depending on a lot of things. And it's okay that people see it differently. The fact is that the dress in real life is blue and black. The actual dress in that space, when the woman took a picture of it in the store, was blue and black. If you see it as white and gold, you're not wrong. If you see it as blue and black, you're not wrong either. It's just that your brain translates that information based on this theory of color constancy. So looking at the dress right now, I'm seeing it as blue and black, but I've seen it as white and gold before. I opened it in Photoshop and checked it before too, and it's not blue and black. The pixels of that photo are not blue and black, that is. So they're warm pixels. The reason for this is because the camera taking the picture automatically adjusted the white balance, which is looking at the light source and adjusting all the colors in the image to correct for that white source. And it did it wrong, completely did it wrong, and it overexposed the picture. Now, if you bring it into Photoshop and you just correct the white balance and the exposure, don't change the color of the image, the pixels or anything like that, but it'll switch and you'll be able to measure the color either way. So yeah, anyway, you can go down a rabbit hole talking about this image too, but it illustrates the idea of color constancy. And this is another one of those psychological factors that color, sometimes it's amazing that our brains can see and perceive such difference in color, but it's also amazing that we can see such different color from each other. All right. So moving on into some more stuff here. We're talking about color theory before, where we have three cells that can perceive different colors, and they get activated with different colors. And depending on the amount of a certain wavelength of light, we see a certain color. Well, this opponent process theory works kind of the same way. It's still based on the fact that we have three photoreceptors in our eyes. We have three color receptors, these cones that are kind of keyed into different wavelengths of light. They happen to be red, green, and blue light. So each one peaks at different portions of that spectrum, but they each have some overlap too. So the red sensitive cones can also pick up, they get activated when there's other wavelengths of light too. It's not like they just have a spike of red and that's all they can see. So they overlap, obviously. Now, we know from anatomy that those cells connect to a certain kind of cell called a ganglion cell. Those ganglion cells are always active. They get the most energy with certain types of light from certain types of cones. but they're always active. So they pulsate faster or slower with less light or more light in certain wavelengths, depending on which cones are connected to those ganglions. So anyway, what the concept here that we're talking about is that we have these opposing signals. We're still getting a signal with a lack of a certain wavelength, and we're still getting a signal with an excess of a certain wavelength of light. Either way, we're getting those signals, and our brain sorts that out. So whether there's light coming in a certain wavelength or there's not, we're still seeing an image. Our brain is seeing an image. And the next few slides are going to kind of illustrate that, hopefully. Now, full disclosure, I have a vision deficiency myself, not color blindness. It's more complex than that, and we can get into it in Slack if you guys are really curious. But it makes it so that I have a really hard time making this next illusion work. I've been told it works, but I honestly can't see it. So you guys can let me know if it works for you or not. All right, so what you're going to do is I'm going to display some circles in sequence here for about 20 to 30 seconds each. So stare at those. I put a little dot in the center of the circles so it's easier to focus on one place and kind of not wander around with your eyes. Try to stare at the same spot, and then right after that, I'm going to show a white slide. So this works best if you are able to just pause the video for a second and turn off the lights so that your screen is the primary light source, okay? All right, so stare at that green circle or the white dot right in the center of that. Stare at it. Keep staring. Just focus on that. Try not to let your eyes wander around. And I'm going to stop talking here. All right, did you see a negative image there? Possibly? All right, let's try it again. This time we'll do red. And I'm not going to leave it for 30 seconds here. If you want to, you can pause the video. So pause it now, otherwise I'm going to proceed. All right. And lastly, we'll do blue. So I'm going to let it sit for about 5 seconds, and then I'll advance it. So if you want to look longer, go ahead and pause it. Okay, now I'm going to advance. All right, hopefully the effect worked for you and you're able to see the negative after image there. And that's illustrating, that's supporting the concept of this opponent process color theory, is because we have that opposing signal from the alternating pulses that it leaves a negative after image. So here's another one just to try out. Stare at the X in the center. So the red and the green squares will kind of be to the side. So stare and focus on the X in the center. Again, for 30 seconds. I'm going to advance, so if you want to keep looking longer, go ahead and pause it. Okay, now I'm going to advance. Same thing, you should have seen an alternating, a negative after image there. We can do the same thing with this, and I'm going to move on pretty quickly here, so pause it and advance at your own pace if you want to, but same sort of thing. All right, so that's that. I don't have any more images to show you right now, but you can look up a lot. There's a ton of these kind of visual color illusions that you can find online if you want to go down that rabbit hole a little bit. It's something that you might bring up and mention in our discussion board topic for the week, because we're going to talk about some of these psychological and physical factors of color.